and what could stand? Water you turn into wine, you open the eyes of the blind. There's no one like you. Who else commands all the hosts of heaven? Who else can make every king bow down? Who else can whisper and darkness trembles? Only a holy God. What other beauty demands such praises? What other splendor outshines the sun? What other majesty rules with justice? Only a holy God. Come and behold him, the one and the only. Cry out, sing holy, forever a holy God. Come and worship the holy God. What other glory consumes like fire? What other power can raise the dead? What other name remains undefeated? Only a holy God. Come and behold him, the one and the only. Cry out, sing holy, forever a holy God. Come and worship the holy God. Who else can rescue me from my failing? Who else would offer his only son? Who else invites me to call him Father? Only a holy God. Only a holy God. Come and behold him, the one and the only. Cry out, sing holy, forever This is my prayer in the fire, in weakness or trial or pain. There is a faith proved of more worth than gold, so refine me, Lord, through the flame. I will bring praise, I will bring praise. No weapon formed against me shall remain. I will rejoice, I will declare, God is my victory and He is here. This is my prayer in the battle, when triumph is still on its way. I am a conqueror and co-heir with Christ, so firm on His promise I'll stand. I will bring praise, I will bring praise. No weapon formed against me shall remain. I will rejoice, I will declare, God is my victory and He is here. All of my life, in every season, You are still God, and I have a reason to sing. I have a reason to worship. All of my life, in every season, You are still God, and I have a reason to sing. I have a reason to worship. I will bring praise, I will bring praise. No weapon formed against me shall remain. I will rejoice, I will declare, God is my victory and He is here. This is my prayer in the harvest, when favor and providence flow. I know I'm filled to be emptied again. The seed I received I will sow.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Thursday night Bible study, Deep Calls to Deep, here at Friendship Bible Church. We haven't been together for a couple of weeks, so we are going to be doing Judges chapter 4 and do a little review of the first 3 chapters of Judges tonight. Before we get started, let's go to the Lord in prayer and ask His blessing for tonight's service. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank You for this time that we have to learn Your word and learn about a group of people who had their flaws. And I just pray that we will see how You've interacted with them and what a great God You are amidst some difficult circumstances, Lord. So as we study this wonderful chapter tonight, I just pray that You'll bless the time together, open up hearts and minds to Your word and to Your gentle guidance as we study through the book of Judges. Thank You for the word. Thank You for the freedom we have still in this country to gather together and just fellowship together as a body, Lord. So I pray for everyone here and pray for everyone at home that You will just guide them tonight through the scriptures as we study Judges chapter 4. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so everybody should have read Judges chapter 4. Now remember, I always ask you to read a chapter ahead. Also, write down any questions that you may have. So that way, if I don't cover something, that you can ask those questions that I might not have covered. Any of your thoughts? That's fine. I like I said, I want you guys to do that. I want you to read through the chapter ahead and just jot down some notes. And so don't be afraid to ask those questions the following week. If you're at home and you want to get together with me during the week or get those questions to me during the week, you can do that as well. Liz, if you are at home now watching with your sister, I have notes from Judge's introduction all the way to tonight's chapter 4. So I'll have these at the church so that you can send them to her as we move through. So I got that. So, all right, here we go. Judges chapter 4. So it's been a couple of weeks, so I just want to start by reviewing the first 3 chapters in the book of Judges. I'm just going to broad brush it so that we just get some of the highlights. So going back to chapter 1, it gave us the political background for the book. And although some tribes had their successes and some were more successful than others, all of the tribes had their problems driving out the Canaanites from their allotted territory. Now, cities during the time of the Shoftim were either fully Canaanite, they just were never conquered at all. They were mixed cities where Jews and Canaanites kind of lived together in some type of harmony. And so we see that in the book of Judges as well. Or the cities were fully under control of the individual tribes, with the Canaanites themselves used as forced labor. Now, there were other cities that changed hands at times. For example, Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron were Philistine cities originally conquered by Judah, but later in Judges they fell back under Philistine control. And so you will find these cities that have changed hands at times. The bottom line is that this failure and disobedience that started during the time of Joshua would set the tone for the book of Judges. The author, who has now set up this political situation, gives us the spiritual background in chapter 2. The angel of the Lord, or the Malach of Yahweh, appeared to the people while Joshua was still alive to tell them that because they have not obeyed him in driving out all the inhabitants of the promised land, that he was going to leave them in the land. These Canaanites would become a snare and a stumbling block. Now, the people were already making peace treaties with the Canaanites at this time, and instead of breaking down the altars of Baal, they left them under the guise of tolerance and compromise. Being tired after years of fighting, they just decided to make nice with them. And even though all these negative consequences were set in motion during the time of Joshua, as long as Joshua and the elders were alive, the people remained relatively in a good spiritual condition. The priesthood was intact along with the rituals and the observance of the law. But when Joshua and these elders died, another generation arose who did not know the Lord or really appreciate all that God had done for their forefathers. Now remember, this does not mean that they were ignorant or unaware of these stories of the Red Sea crossing or Egypt or the conquest, but rather they deemed these events as having no value or being simply inconsequential to their lives. The treaties and marriages with the Canaanites were their new reality and really their priority, not war or even the eradication of evil. And that was God's priority, but that was not theirs any longer. So it didn't take long after the death of Joshua for Israel to be steeped in idolatry, breaking faith with their God, and caught up in syncretism. A half a century in the land of Canaan, and Israel spiritually looked nothing like those who crossed the Jordan with Joshua. So God would discipline Israel by bringing an oppressor in the land to lead them back to himself and away from these practices. After a period of time, tribes being oppressed would, quote get it, right? Take them a little while, but they would get it. Then they would cry to the Lord for help, and he would raise a shofet from among them. God would empower the judge by having the Holy Spirit come upon them, which was a temporary arrangement, in order to aid them in leading a group of tribes from this oppression. After the military victory, those tribes would have peace for the lifetime of the judge, but would fall back into idolatry soon after his death, and the cycle continues. Now, our last week together, we studied 3 shoftim. Othniel, who judged Judah in the south and defeated the doubly wicked Cushite, then had 40 years of peace. Ehud, who judged Benjamin and Ephraim in the center part of the country and defeated Eglon, king of Moab, then had 80 years of peace. Finally, Shamgar, who saved Israel in the period after Othniel's death and after Ehud's military exploits, but before Ehud's death. It makes more sense, basically, that Shamgar was probably a contemporary of Ehud's. But his exploits certainly didn't take place until after Ehud finished his military exploits. Everybody got that? So we are given no specifics, but Philistine trouble leads me to conclude that Shamgar was either delivering Judah or Dan or both. So, any questions about the first 3 chapters? They sound like us today. Joan says, sounds like us today. Yeah, absolutely. History repeating itself. We're going to go over that and kind of explore those things as we move on. Now, before we begin chapter 4, I want to remind you that God was showing his people and us as we read and study this book that they needed a king. This is a nightmare. As you can see, we're 3 chapters into this book, and there's a lot of trouble here. They will eventually understand that they could not survive without a strong central government and a king to lead them, like the leadership they had under Moses and Joshua, which was a very steadying influence. And they're going to want for that. But they made the mistake for asking for a king just like the nations around them. These kings were selfish, power-hungry rulers who would never concern themselves with the welfare of their citizens unless it served their own purposes. Kings collected horses, wives, and riches. That's what kings did. They ruled with a paranoia of holding on to power because everyone was out to dethrone them. History will repeat itself, as we have seen several ways so far in this book, because there will come a time when the world will look toward a man who has all the answers, a man with a plan. He will promise the world peace, but he will be like any other selfish leader with a selfish agenda. We call him who? The Antichrist. Once again, the wrong type of king is asked for by the masses, and the Lord will allow him to rule as Saul was allowed to rule in Israel. The final conquest of Canaan and the defeat of this false king at the end of the tribulation will usher in our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ as the true king. Finally, after all these generations of waiting, we will have a king that will rule righteously. His rule will bring peace that we all long for. His rule will not be selfish or be for the good, but will be for the good of all of his subjects. Without this king, we would all be lost, like the Israelites in the time of the judges. Now, before we begin chapter 4, I wanted to show you a brief video, and you're going to be introduced to the bad guy, okay? So here are the bad guys up here. Enjoy the video. It's just a couple minutes long.
1700 years before Jesus came, Hazor was a monumental, prosperous, and powerful city of the Canaanite people. The city had an allegiance to the Pharaoh of Egypt and was a stronghold, having trade relations with the superpowers of Babylon and Syria. Hazor was one of the most fortified and influential cities of the time. It was a capital of capitals, or as the book of Joshua puts it, it was the head of all those kingdoms. When the children of Israel conquered the kings of the southern lands of Canaan, word got back to the north country. King Jabin, the influential leader of Hazor, created a coalition of all the leaders and their armies of the region, a force vast and ominous. In spite of this, God delivered them into the hand of Joshua, and although all the region was conquered, Joshua completely destroyed the city of Hazor because it was the most powerful of the region and the leader of the coalition. Apparently, Hazor rebuilt, and under King Jabin were oppressing the people of Israel in the times of the judges. When Deborah was judge in Israel, she sent for the military commander Barak and instructed him to assemble a 10,000-person army and head north to Mount Tabor. Hazor's King Jabin sent his army commander, Sisera, along with 900 iron chariots to wage war. Sisera was defeated and fled on foot to the tent of a woman named Jael, who subsequently killed him with a tent peg while he slept. This loss destroyed the power of King Jabin and Hazor. During Solomon's reign, the city would become a highly fortified city again, along with Megiddo and Gezer. Solomon would draw conscripted labor from Hazor for the building of the first temple and for his own palace in Jerusalem. During the divided kingdom, Hazor became part of the northern kingdom of Israel. While King Pekah was reigning in Samaria, the Assyrians invaded under the leadership of King Tiglath-Pileser. The kingdom of Israel was conquered, and Hazor fell. The people were carried into exile from their homeland in an ongoing conquest by the Assyrians that would eventually bring an end to the northern kingdom of Israel. Today, Hazor is a massive archaeological site and a World Heritage Site. It was one of the first to be fully excavated when the modern Jewish state was formed after World War II. Its gorgeous location, with stunning views of Mount Hermon, and its strategic position reveal why it was prosperous and why it was contended for so many times in biblical history.
Introduce you to the bad guys. There they are. Now, I might say Hatzor. I'm just used to saying that. It's Hazor. So if I get caught saying Hatzor, I mean Hazor. I'll say it that way. Okay, so let's start in Judges chapter 4. Let's open up to Judges chapter 4, and I'm going to read the first 16 verses of our chapter. Okay, Judges chapter 4, starting in verse 1, first 16 verses. Okay, then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor, and the commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. The sons of Israel cried to the Lord, for he had 900 iron chariots, and he oppressed the sons of Israel severely for 20 years. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at the time. And she used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel came up to her for judgment. Now she sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, Behold, the Lord, the God of Israel, has commanded, Go and march to Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and from the sons of Zebulun. I will draw out to you Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his many troops, to the river Kishon, and I will give him into your hand. Then Barak said to her, if you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the honor shall not be yours on the journey that you are about to take, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. Now Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali together to Kadesh, and 10,000 men went up with him. Deborah also went with him. Now Heber the Kenite had separated himself from the Kenites, from the sons of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far away as the oak of Zananim, which is near Kadesh. Then they told Sisera that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. Sisera called together all his chariots, 900 iron chariots, and all the people who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. Deborah said to Barak, arise, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Behold, the Lord has gone out before you. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. The Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not even one was left. So what we're going to look at in the first 16 verses are basically the introduction to the good guys and the bad guys all the way to the end of this battle. Okay, so bear with me as we go through this. Now, verse 1 gives us a timestamp. Really, the events that happen in chapter 4, and if you've looked ahead, chapter 5 is the Song of Deborah, which recounts the things that occur in chapter 4. So we're going to see some other things, maybe a little bit more detail in chapter 5. But both chapters occur after Ehud dies. Harry mentioned last time we were together how the word again is used for Israel's behavior, kind of like a dog returning to his own vomit. Not learning from their fellow tribes, the oppression now comes from the far northern part of Israel. Those tribes are being disciplined for their idolatry. If you take a look at the map, real quick to orient yourself, we're all the way far to the north. You see the Sea of Galilee over there? Now the star above the Sea of Galilee, that's Hatzor, okay? And so we have actually 3 tribes that are in blue. It's really 2. It's really Naphtali and Zebulun. Issachar does become part of this battle, but we're going to look at them next week. So Naphtali surrounds the Sea of Galilee on the western side, and Zebulun is just below, okay? And those are the 2 tribes from today's study. So Israel's oppressor was a man named King Jabin. Or it's a king named Jabin. And once again, we have a dynastic title, not a personal name, okay? Over a century before in Joshua chapter 11, we saw that in the video, we have another Jabin, king of Hatzor, who was defeated by Joshua and killed. The city of Hatzor was burned, and all the inhabitants were killed in that chapter as well. So this Jabin may have been a blood relative of the former Jabin, who has now, this blood relative has rebuilt the city and restored the rule in Hatzor once again. Could this guy have been a regular Canaanite, another Canaanite who took on the dynastic title because it was attached to the city? It's a possibility. More than likely, it probably was a blood relative that somehow survived, and he takes on the name Jabin. Okay, so once again, we don't have a discrepancy here in our scriptures. It's just a dynastic title here. Now, we looked at the map. Hazer or Hatzor is located north of the Sea of Galilee in the territory of Naphtali. And we have Jabin's military commander here named as Sisera. He lived in Harosheth Hagoyim, which means woodlands of the Gentiles. Now, here on the map, our next map, is the best guess to where the city is. Most scholars place it a little south and west of Hatzor by the Kishon River and the Jezreel Valley. So, yeah, the next slide. Okay, so everybody sees where the Sea of Galilee is. And as you travel down, if you go down and you're going actually west towards the Mediterranean Sea, you see the red dot. That's where Harosheth Hagoyim is. Now, the green pasture that runs down, it kind of runs south and east. You see it? How it's not mountainous? That's the Jezreel Valley. So right at the western end of the Jezreel Valley is where Sisera was. That would be important because he would need the chariots to run on flat ground, right? Now, right down the center of the Jezreel Valley is a blue line. That is the Kishon River. It kind of ran directly straight down in the middle of the Jezreel Valley, okay? So you can't really see it that well, but Pastor Chaz is bringing the cursor around. That's the Kishon, all right? Everybody got a little idea. And really, if you follow that all the way down, you go right to just about to the foot of Mount Tabor. All right, so there's a little bit of what it looked like. So we went over this. Hatzor itself, I shouldn't say went over this. In the video, they went over how Hatzor was a very important city because it fell along the Via Maris. And the Via Maris was a very, very important trade route. This was probably the most important trade route at the time, and it began in Egypt and northern Africa, and it wound all the way to Western Asia. So Hatzor was a very important city, and really, not only during the time of Judges, but this time Hatzor is a lead city in a coalition. Don't think that King Jabin was a city unto himself. There were other cities that were a part of a coalition. So this is a tough city-state, and this is a pretty tough king and army. So in verse 3, it tells us that Jabin used 900 chariots. It's a huge number at this time. Sometimes when we read these numbers, we don't have any idea. Well, what does that kind of mean? So to put this number in perspective, it was said that Thutmose, a pharaoh known for his military might, he was an Egyptian pharaoh, he had 924 chariots in the whole Egyptian army, or thereabouts. So Jabin had just about the same amount of chariots as Egypt had in their entire army. So this is huge. So I wanted you to understand that this is a lot of chariots. And another historical thought I just threw in here was they think that the Hyksos kings, they were the ones that went down and gave Egypt a lot of trouble. They think that they're the ones that actually introduced the iron chariots originally to the Canaanites and other weapons of war. Either way, Jabin had a huge advantage in a reason. Actually, one that could not be challenged unless you have the true and living God on your side, right? So he oppressed Israel for 20 years. When I was introducing the book of Judges, I was saying to you how some of the tribes and some of the areas, it took them a very, very long time to realize and get it that there's a major problem here. So finally, after 20 years here, they finally humbled themselves and went to the only source of victory, the only path to relief. So somebody in Naphtali and Zebulun was crying out to the Lord. And maybe that remnant will we constantly talk about, right? So in verses 4 and 5, we are introduced to Deborah. So the Lord hears, obviously, right? So he's going to communicate with his woman, not his man, his woman. She's going to be the fourth judge. Now, what is interesting about Deborah is she is first listed as a prophetess. Female prophets were very rare in the Bible, and they were so rare that only a handful are listed. There are two others in the Old Testament itself. One was Miriam, one other was Miriam, Moses' sister, in Exodus 15:20, and Huldah in 2 Kings 22:14. Good old Huldah. You know all about Huldah, right? Probably not. So let's read the account. I just want to take a little time to read the account in 2 Kings. We're going to go to 2 Kings real quick and see who this Huldah is. We're in 2 Kings chapter 22. We're going to be reading, or I'm going to be reading verses 8 through 17. We're not going to finish it. 2 Kings chapter 22. We're going to start in verse 8. Let me give you a little background here. The leaders in Israel have found the book of the law, probably Deuteronomy or the whole Pentateuch. So they found the book of the law. What does that mean about the law? It was missing. So the following passage tells us how they react. All right? Chapter 22. Okay, this is after they find the book of the law. Okay, then Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, or Shaphan, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, who read it. Shaphan the scribe came to the king and brought back word to the king and said, your servants have emptied out the money that was found in the house and have delivered it to the hand of the workmen who have the oversight of the house of the Lord. Moreover, Shaphan the scribe told the king, saying, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. And Shaphan read it in the presence of the king. And it came about when the king heard the words of the book of the law that he tore his clothes. Can you imagine what that said? What do you think was read to him? I mean, can you get a kind of an idea? It probably wasn't the blessing part. It was probably the cursing parts, right? All the things that they were supposed to do, but they weren't doing. And so the king commanded Hilkiah, the priest, and Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, and Akbar, the son of Micaiah, Shaphan the scribe, and Asaiah the king's servant, saying, go to the house of the Lord and inquire of the Lord for me. And let's inquire of the Lord and find out what's going on here. No, I'm joking. That is not what they did. Listen to what they do here. Now, I want to remind you that at the king's disposal, he has all of the leaders, including the high priests. So these are all of the people who are in charge of the law, who are supposed to know the law, who are supposed to be teaching the law. Go inquire the Lord for me and the people and all Judah concerning the word of this book that has been found, for great is the wrath of the Lord that burns against us, because our fathers have not listened to the words of this book to do according to all that is written concerning us. So Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam, Ichabod, Shaphan, Asaiah, and went to Huldah the prophetess. So all these powerful men, they went to Huldah, the wife of Shallum, the son of Tikvah, the son of Harhas, keeper of the wardrobe. Now she lived in Jerusalem in the second quarter, and they spoke to her. And she said to them, thus says the Lord God of Israel, tell the man who sent you to me. Who's that? The king. Tell the man who sent you to me. Thus says the Lord, behold, I bring evil on this place and on its inhabitants, even all the words of the book which the king of Judah has read, because they have forsaken me and have burned incense to other gods, that they might provoke me to anger with all the works of their hands. Therefore my wrath burns against this place, and it shall not be quenched. Now, the chapter goes on, but I want to stop there. A prophetess received word from the Lord directly, just like Elijah and Elisha. Huldah was held in such high regard that King Josiah sent the highest ranking officials, including a scribe and the high priest, to Huldah to inquire of the Lord. Her word was unquestioned by the king and these men. Deborah, like Huldah, was spoken to by God directly, and this gift was known by many in Israel. Now, what makes the story of Huldah and the story of Deborah really connect? They were definitely women, which is unusual. Mary said the men obviously weren't listening to the Lord. Great. It's the same connection I made. I wonder if there was, in both cases, a real lack of male leadership in Israel. Now, I am in no way suggesting that God only uses women when men don't step up. Plenty of great women in the Bible, right? But the same lack of knowledge of the scriptures and a lack of male leadership seems to be characteristic of both times. The time of Josiah, he tears his clothes when he realizes they have all but ignored God's laws, right? And they were doing the same thing during this rudderless time of the judges. So I see that parallel. Either way, the point is that Deborah was held in such high regard, just like Huldah, as a prophet, that the people made her a shofet, a judge. Now, Deborah was an exception to the rule that our shoftim were more saviors and military leaders who didn't necessarily rule in court cases. Those types of judges were established in Deuteronomy. Deborah was a judge in the more traditional sense, in the sense of Deuteronomy. And in verse 5, it explains that all Israel came to her. This would include all the central tribes and all the northern tribes. People came from all over to see her. Now, every tribe would have what we consider the lower courts. So they would have clan leaders solving disputes. They would still have court cases that they would have at the city gates. We learned that if you study enough Old Testament history, that went on. But the cases brought before Deborah would have been major intertribal or intratribal cases, meaning only the biggest cases were brought to her. Deborah chose her seat of judgment to be under the palm tree of Deborah, it says. Now, some scholars think that the location here is tied to Genesis 35:8, where Rebekah's nurse Deborah was buried under an oak tree below Bethel, in around the same area. And so they conclude that maybe it's the same tree. Or they conclude that Deborah chose this exact tree where the Genesis Deborah was buried. Now, I have three problems with this conclusion. And I looked at it three ways, the sideways, and I looked at everything. First, there's no biblical reference or cross-reference that supports this idea. You can't find it anywhere. Second, the Hebrew word tomer, which translated date palm, is a completely different word from the one used for oak in Genesis. That Hebrew word is alan. So an oak tree is an alan, a date palm is a tomer. Third, and I put up on the slide, Pastor Chaz has put up, the trees look so completely different that the author could not have been describing the same tree, though sometimes we do have variations in words in different eras. I mean, that does happen. But you can see the date palm does not look anything like an oak. And Deborah chose the date palm. Now, the conclusion is that Deborah heard the most important civil court cases of the central and northern tribes from under a date palm near Bethel, which was named after herself. So the date palm, the palm of Deborah, was not named after the Genesis Deborah. I don't believe that. Now, could Deborah had become a Hebrew name in honor of this nurse Deborah, which was given great honor during the time of the patriarchs? That could be true. Could this Deborah herself be named after that Deborah? Sure, that's the case. That could be the case. But the date palm of Deborah was named after Deborah herself. The people named that. Now, these date palms were scattered throughout the Holy Land. You can find them everywhere, north, south, east, west. But see, the importance here is that the palm tree was a symbol that conveyed this, that she would rule justly, showing no partiality and no favoritism. So if you went to Deborah, by sitting under that tree, she was guaranteeing a fair and impartial ruling. And that's kind of what that said for her. So that's why she was there. So in verse 6, after hearing from the Lord, she headed north to find a man named Barak, who the Lord chose as the next Shofet. And she traveled a pretty good way. If you see on the next slide, he lived in Kadesh, Naphtali, which was on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, all the way up. And you see the red line. I don't know if you can see it that well, but Deborah was down by the blue, which is Benjamin. Ephraim is the purple down there, and you see the red line going through Manasseh all the way up to the north. So she traveled a good way all the way up. So this guy was chosen because he was from the tribe of Naphtali. So naturally, he was chosen to lead the 10,000 from his tribe and from the tribe of Zebulun. And he led them to Mount Tabor. Also, Hatzor was in his tribal territory, and Jabin was the source of his oppression. So naturally, Barak was chosen. So in verse 7, God makes it clear that he would draw, or this is the Hebrew word, mashak. I love that word. He's going to mashak Sisera. He's going to draw him out of Harosheth Hagoyim to travel down the Kishon River, which ran along the Jezreel Valley. We talked about it towards the foot of Mount Tabor. And then God would give Barak the victory. In verse 8, Barak says that if Deborah would not go with him, then he would not go. But if she goes, then he will go. Now, I don't want to make too much of this because sometimes prophets were asked to join a battle in planning, and it's nice to know that you have somebody within the battle camp who can hear from the Lord. But the verse does seem to indicate that his decision or his hesitation here was going to take some of the honor away from him. You know who I automatically thought about? I thought about Zechariah. When he was told that he was going to have a child, right? And he didn't totally deny it, but he had some doubts, and then he was struck mute. I just kind of see it that way. Barak didn't hesitate, much, but the little bit of hesitation in this, it's back and forth, seemed to be a problem, and the Lord's going to take away a little bit of the honor. Specifically, it was the honor that one general received when capturing an enemy general. You usually are given that honor. In Barak's case, the honor would be given to a woman, but not the one you might think. And we'll talk about that later. So Barak and Deborah took the troops up to Mount Tabor in verses 11 and 12, and then it says that a man named Heber, a Kenite, informed Sisera of Barak's movements. Now remember that the Kenites were Moses' father-in-law's people who went down to live in Judah's territory. You remember that? Judah went down into their territory, and they asked the Kenites to go with them. Hobab was Moses' brother-in-law. Now, some people don't like to mark their Bible. If you want to put a mark on that, I am almost convinced. All right, Hobab is not a third name for Jethro. Hobab is the brother-in-law. It's translated improperly. Hobab was Moses' brother-in-law, and that's verse 11 there. And for reasons that we're not told, this man separated his family from the rest of the Kenites and moved north. I don't know if he originally went down with them and then something happened and he left, or he just never went with them and moved his family up north. It also says that he had a peace treaty with King Jabin in verse 17. And possibly, I wrote, he had animosity towards Israel. We're not given any details. Maybe there was a problem there. I don't know. So either way, he warned Sisera that a rebellion may be brewing. So, verses 13 through 16, finishing up our section we read, we have the battle at the Kishon. So, Sisera, we talked about it before, took his 900 chariots, and starting at Harosheth Hagoyim, he followed the Kishon River down toward Mount Tabor. Now, some scholars treat Sisera like an idiot. That's the only explanation I can come up with. And they claim that this was a mistake because he should have known that there could have been mud around the river area. Listen, and I want you guys to understand this. Sisera was no dummy, and he didn't make mistakes, not in battle. Sisera made not one mistake or calculation. He was in the Lord's hands, we know that. But he was a seasoned military veteran who patrolled this area for 20 years. The Kishon River, even though it is the second largest river in the land, it is often dry during the summer months. This is why I conclude that this battle occurred during the dry season, and I have to refer to the experts who have been to the Holy Land who assure me that during the dry season, many rivers become simply dry riverbeds in Israel. Sisera was using the dry riverbed of the Kishon to travel down to Mount Tabor. He is not worried about mud because, frankly, there is none. In the meantime, Israel's army is safe on Mount Tabor. Why? Why are they at their safest place on top of this mountain? It's high up. And what don't you do in battle? First of all, you don't take those iron chariots up there. You just don't. You can't. That's why they patrol the valleys. They don't patrol the mountains. Lots of times where there's iron chariots, the people are chased up into the mountains, basically. So one, you do not take those iron chariots, and two, you do not attack anyone who's on the high ground. You never attack going uphill. The high ground, that's right. The high ground's the place to be. That warning was there. That's right, he didn't listen. Never attack on the high ground. So those are two things that kept them safe. So what does God do? He tells them to go down. He tells them to go down into the waiting arms of Sisera and those 900 chariots. We have spent a lot of time criticizing Israel so far, right? And with good reason. But I want you to think about these men like the remnant we always discuss, or we've been discussing. They answered the call even though King Jabin and his commander Sisera were unrivaled for many years in military might. And I can't stress enough how frightening these iron chariots were even to the most hardened warrior. So when the command came to march down Mount Tabor, many military veterans, even if, maybe there wasn't any military veterans, right? This is a group of volunteers. But if there were military veterans, they were being told to go against all training, logic, and instinct. They were marching to the slaughter. Now, verses 15 and 16 are sort of anticlimactic. If you read it straight on through, it really is. We have this whole battle setting up, and then the Lord gave Israel the victory. Barak's army chased down the enemy soldiers as they fled back to Harosheth Hagoyim and killed everyone. And at the same time, Sisera left his chariot and got away on foot. So what happened? How in the world did Israel defeat this army, and what happened to these unbeatable iron chariots? Now, it's not all obvious, but I think that the answer is found in chapter 5. So let's go turn the page to Judges chapter 5. This is the Song of Deborah, and it sometimes it's going to provide next week a little bit more detail as to what happened in chapter 4. Except the language is flowery, so we're going to have to deal with that, a little poetic. Verses 19 to 22 gives us a kind of a poetic hint as to what happened to Sisera. Now, see if you can follow me. The previous verses explain who joined the battle and who didn't for the total battle, not necessarily for this general battle here at Mount Tabor. And just after she goes over the list, she says this in verse 19. The kings came and fought, then fought the kings of Canaan. At Tanakh, near the waters of Megiddo, they took no plunder in silver. The stars fought from heaven. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The torrent of Kishon swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent Kishon. O my soul, march on with strength. The torrent. What would cause a dry riverbed to fill up suddenly? How could the Kishon be called a torrent when I would argue with you that it was probably just a dry riverbed? Anybody know the answer to that? My opinion, it's a flash flood. Slide 7, right? You see the army of Sisera in blue. You see the Kishon behind them. You see a flooded out area here. I have heard stories of dry riverbeds killing hikers in Israel because they were caught in a dry riverbed during a flash flood. It's happened. Swept people away. Heavy rain. Heavy rain causing a flash flood, right? And then causing the Kishon, which I would argue is a dry riverbed, to become a torrent. And a torrent means raging waters. It doesn't. And if it happens during the dry season and you get a sudden thunderstorm that the Lord sent himself, then you have a problem. Let's recount the story. So just to give you kind of like just a little overview here. Israel is giving up the only advantage they have, the high ground, as they march down to their doom, steadily moving closer and closer to Sisera and those 900 chariots. Sisera cannot believe his luck, and maybe Israel's stupidity. This is going to be easy. He's rubbing his hands together. He can't believe what they're doing. They're marching to the slaughter. No one can help them now, not even the God of Israel, for this battle is too one-sided. I put, then boom, right? The heavens open up, and a heavy thunderstorm is suddenly unleashed by Jehovah. The once dry riverbed is now a torrent. As it swallows some of the chariots whole, I have no doubt that they were caught in the Kishon River itself. And they're all swept away, while others were stuck in an increasingly muddy battlefield. Their army starts to panic, and they start to leave their chariots and alight away on foot. Sisera himself cannot get his chariot unstuck as well, so with no dignity left, he flees the opposite way, hoping to escape notice. You know, a little bit about that torrent talks about how the horses in verse 22, hoofs beat from the dashing of his valiant steeds, seem to indicate a muddy battlefield. All of a sudden, this army commander, who would never have made this mistake, was caught. And look, they just left those chariots. Those chariots were stuck. Israel chased them down. Okay, so let's go back. Any questions about verses 1 through 16? And we'll get a little bit more of the battle next week as we study through Deborah's song next week. Right, well, you remember that this is occurring because the northern tribes, specifically Naphtali and Zebulun, must have been steeped in idolatry. And the Lord allowed this man to come into Jabin, come into Hatzor, rebuild that area, build up this 900 chariot army and oppress them. So God was judging this northern area because they were in idolatry. And so he was using Sisera and he was using Jabin to discipline them for 20 years. So you got to remember that before this battle, somebody in Naphtali and Zebulun was crying out to the Lord. They were seeking the Lord. Who? No, Jabin was the Canaanites. And Jabin, he had that whole area. You have him up here in Hatzor, and you have Sisera roaming all these plains right here. And this whole area by the Sea of Galilee was basically controlled by this king. And so this was a major oppression, and it was a long time, 20 years. And finally, somebody cried out to the Lord. So in verse 17, just after this battle ends, let's find out what happens here. I'm going to read here to the end of the chapter. Now Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. For there was peace between Jabin, the king of Hatzor, and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my master, turn aside to me. Do not be afraid." And he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. And he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a bottle of milk and gave him a drink, and she covered him. And he said to her, "Stand in the doorway of the tent, and it shall be that if anyone comes and inquires of you and says, 'Is there anyone here?' that you shall say, 'No.'" But Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg and seized a hammer in her hand and went secretly to him and drove the peg into his temple, and it went through to the ground, into the ground. For he was sound asleep and exhausted, so he died. And behold, as Barak pursued Sisera, Jael came out to meet him and said to him, "Come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking." And he entered with her, and behold, Sisera was lying dead with a tent peg in his temple. So God subdued on that day Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the sons of Israel. The hand of the sons of Israel pressed heavier and heavier upon Jabin, the king of Canaan, until they had destroyed Jabin, the king of Canaan. And at the very end of chapter 5, it says, "And the land was undisturbed for 40 years." Okay? So, what we have starting in verse 17, Sisera pulls a pro move. Right? The whole army fled this way, right? To Harosheth Hagoyim. They're all going this way. Sisera is going to go this way. Okay? So while the rest of his army are fleeing back to Harosheth on foot, he decides to use this distraction to travel in the opposite direction. He is actually traveling towards the Sea of Galilee, Barak's hometown of Kadesh. But what lies near Kadesh is his ally Heber, somewhere outside the city, near the Sea of Galilee. So, if he can make it to Heber's camp, then he will be safe. Does anybody know why? And you would have to know a little bit about Bedouins and nomads. And study your Old Testament. Why would he be safe? They take care of their guests. Right. So, nomadic Middle Eastern culture has a code that they take very seriously, if you've done any study. If a friend or a stranger is a guest under their roof or tent, then they are responsible to protect that individual, even if it means their own death or the death of a family member. Now, we're going to see this later in Judges, but we also see this code kind of played out with Lot and Sodom with the protection of the two angels. Everybody remember that story? He was willing to send out his own daughters, right, to these men to protect the two angels that he may possibly not have known they were angels. They were under his roof, and they take this code very seriously. So in verse 18, when Sisera arrives at Heber's camp and Jael is invited into her tent, he thought he was home free. No doubt his plan was probably to rest for a day or two, then maybe travel back to Hatzor and meet up with Jabin and regroup. So it's not over yet. Another thing that you do not do in this culture is search through a woman's part of the tent. Don't do it. So in verse 20, she just simply has to say no, and not even Barak could go into Jael's tent to look for Sisera. We see a little bit of that when Rachel stole her father's idols, right? And she sat on them. Basically, she says, no, they're not here. And then he didn't disturb her. But it really has to do with the culture. You're not going to go into a woman's part of the tent. You just didn't do that.
Anytime you can sit on your God's things.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, those gods weren't worth much. You sit on your gods, you can burn them up as firewood. Yeah, so, this is nomadic Bedouin culture. And so this would have provided him with extra comfort, plus the warm milk, right? He got warm milk. You know what warm milk does? Puts us asleep. So he got his warm milk, and he laid his head down, and he fell asleep. So once he was asleep, Jael took a tent peg and hammer and drove it through his skull, killing him instantly. Right? Now, in case you are doubting the accuracy of this story, like Jael was afraid of breaking a nail, and, oh, this hammer's so heavy, and just, she gets the tent peg, and I want to also talk about Bedouins and nomads. Bedouin nomadic women were the ones responsible for erecting and taking down the tents. That was their job. So Jael would have been quite handy with that hammer and peg. It would have taken Jael just one or two clean strikes to drive that peg through Sisera's temple. I guess Heber was a Democrat and Jael was a Republican. Not sure that Jael agreed with her husband's political views or his stance against Israel. So, sometime later, we're not really sure the period of time, Barak did arrive at Heber's camp, and Joel showed him the body of Sisera, thus fulfilling Deborah's words in verse 9, the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. Now, how many people, when they first read that, thought it was Deborah? Right? When you read it, you think, oh, it's Deborah. And really, Deborah's prophecy was about Jael killing Sisera, right? So that really became honor that was taken away from Barak, and Jael, songs were sung about. So he lost a little bit of that honor that he would have normally had. He lost that to a woman. So that's the fulfillment there. So in verse 24 describes the defeat of King Jabin that came about through a military campaign that we'll talk a little bit about more next week as we get the Song of Deborah and a little bit more details. But, when you read it, if you've read it and you didn't, weren't careful at the very end there, you could think that the battle was over at this point in time. But there's probably other battles and campaigns that we're not told about in the scriptures here. We're not given those battles. The battle was not over. Jabin wasn't captured. His confederacy of cities were not destroyed. And so the victory was far from over. This is the first battle. The Lord broke his power. And they weren't much of a problem after this. Once those, I'm just wondering if they had to go and pull those iron chariots out of the mud, or they just left them. But anyway, in other words, the victory at the Kishon River and the killing of Sisera did not end this war. There are many other battles because remember, Jabin was the head of this confederacy. So Israel would have had to break this power over time. Eventually, they did win, and at the end of chapter 5, it says they rested for 40 years after the war was over. Okay, so questions? Barack Obama. Did you want to say that? We'll pass the mic around.
Is this where Barack Obama got his name?
Is this where Barack Obama got his name? I doubt it, right? If you have a question, let me know. I'll give you the mic.
We know Michelle is really the one who runs that.
Yeah, right. That's right. The same thing with Deborah and Barack, right? Who was in charge there? Anybody else if you have a question, let me know. I'll give you. Anything? Nope. You can get ready. Joan said it's unusual because, usually the women aren't in charge. And you can see probably male leadership as being a problem here. They strayed away from the Lord. There was nobody to lead. And so, the Lord had to speak through Deborah. And, I agree with you. I think that was a problem. You know what? You got to wonder that. Yeah. I would think that it sounds to me that Heber probably was trying to save his own neck and his own skin, and because Jabin was so powerful, he decided if he was going to get along in this territory, he had to make a peace treaty with the man. So he probably was just saving his own skin. I'm sure he must have been upset because this obviously would have threatened that, right? So I'm sure he was not happy. Yeah, if we found out that Egypt marched north with 900 chariots into that area, you would think, boy, that's a lot of chariots. Right. Yeah, and so that, they would have used, like I said, that's why I believe it was, a flash flood. The Lord sent that thunderstorm. And look, the Lord had Sisera right where he wanted him. He drew Sisera right where he wanted him. Sisera was right where he wanted to be. Sisera wasn't where he was in a perfect position. He was right there, and as soon as they came down off Mount Tabor, he was going to mow him down. So as they marched towards Sisera, he can't believe it. He's at an open plain where he has the advantage. He's got 900 chariots. It doesn't matter if they had 10,000 or 20,000 men. They were going to get chewed up. And they got stuck. And as you see the picture, a flash flood would have sucked some chariots down, right on down, would have taken some chariots and drivers right out of commission right away. And as soon as that battlefield became muddy, very interesting probably, as they're meeting them in the battlefield, this is probably as they're in their worst state. They're stuck. They have to get out of their chariots, and Israel just happens to be right there at the right place at the right time, right? So I just, we're thinking about these men as, they're marching towards Sisera. I don't, how much faith do you have to have? Because at what point in time do you say, oh, it's raining, Lord, all right, I knew you were going to get him that way. So there had to have been some doubt. They've had to steel themselves and really be brave and really trust what Deborah said and Barak and trust their leadership. Because it didn't make sense what they were doing. So let's bring this chapter, I'm going to just read this just in a conclusion as we conclude tonight. We have a highly flawed group of men who existed during a time of extreme depravity. And yet, because God is faithful, and because they marched forward in faith, God gave them the victory. They won under seemingly unbeatable odds, as they were really nothing more than a militia versus a highly trained chariot army. I want to finish by saying this. Only by God's grace can we as believers find examples of faith for us to follow in this book during these times. That's the grace of God. And I wanted to say this because we've talked about this so many times. There's always a remnant, right? So no matter how things get bad here in 2021, no matter how crazy the government gets, I don't know what's going to happen with the elections, with our country moving forward. But God has his remnant, right? And we're part of that. Amen? We're his remnant. So we had a remnant during the time of the judges, and we're going to continue to see a remnant that the Lord can always work with, no matter how bad things get. Let's go to the Lord and pray and thank him. Armageddon, right. The Jezreel Valley, Megiddo is on the south side. As a matter of fact, I think in that picture, Judge, can you see, is that Megiddo right there it would be right there. There's Megiddo. There, it's right in kind of in front of where it's fortified and built up. You see where he's pointing? Yeah, it's Megiddo. So yeah, that's the eventual Battle of Armageddon. The staging area is going to be in that area, in the Jezreel Valley. Good point.
Robert says that Napoleon defeated the Turks in the same location, and the same thing happened to the Turks, where their army got sunk in a
Really?
flash flood.
Pastor George said Napoleon beat the Turks in the same area, and it's because they got a flash flood occurred. I didn't know that. Very interesting. A flash flood occurred, and they got stuck in the mud.
You don't say.
Wow. The only difference is, well, probably in both cases, is the Lord sent and had a, right? He was determining who was going to win that battle. But here with his people, right? He sent this himself right on down to help his people.
I wonder if in the Battle of Armageddon there'll be some troops that will get swamped in mud, like mucked up with that same kind of.
Yeah, and that's why I always thought, it's going to be the dry season. There's no way he knew you can't in a wet, rainy season. You're not taking those chariots down, at least not close to the Kishon. You would avoid that. What's that? Right. Yeah, the horses, the chariots are all lost. Yeah, I wonder if they picked them out or what they did with them. They made weapons out of them. I wonder. Everybody thinking that they all left them, right? They left the 900 chariots and they just took off. Tried to get back to Harosheth. All right. Well, good study. Any other comments? Let's go to the Lord in prayer and let's thank Him for tonight's study. Dear Heavenly Father, I just thank You for those who come out tonight on Thursday nights to go through the book of Judges with me. I just appreciate their commitment and dedication, those here and those at home who tune in, Lord. I just thank You for these great examples, battles where You've given Your people victory in insurmountable odds in the most fantastic ways. And we know that in 2021, if You did it then, You can do it now in other ways, in fantastic ways, things that we don't expect. So no matter what goes on in our lives, Lord, I just pray that we'll remain strong, we'll remain firm together in loving Your word, learning Your word, and just being a remnant, Your remnant, Lord, in this country, in this world. So I just pray for all those here and those that are at home. I pray tonight that You will dismiss them and just help them to keep these things in their hearts and their minds throughout the week, things You've done for us. I pray all this, Lord, in Jesus' name, amen.